On December 19, 1944, a sense of alarm hung heavily in the air as Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower entered a cold, drafty command post near Verdun. Maps were spread across tables, their surfaces crowded with pins and grease pencil markings that told a troubling story. German forces had smashed through the Ardennes in a surprise offensive, rupturing the Allied front. American units were falling back in confusion, supply lines were threatened, and the situation was changing by the hour. Eisenhower, normally composed and deliberate, could not ignore the urgency of the moment. The offensive threatened to undo months of hard-won progress. Eisenhower turned to General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army. His expression was grave, his voice direct. He asked the question that everyone in the room knew would define the Allied response. How quickly could Patton redirect his entire army north and strike into the heart of the German advance? The room grew quiet. Officers glanced at one another, some shaking their heads almost imperceptibly. The task seemed beyond reason. Patton's Third Army was more than 100 miles to the south. Deeply engaged in operations against the German Siegfried Line, its divisions were spread across rugged terrain, fighting in freezing weather on narrow, icy roads. Disengaging such a force alone would take days. Reorganizing it, shifting supplies, and launching a coordinated counterattack into the Ardennes seemed to require weeks, not days. Many present assumed that even a partial response would come too late to save. Baston or blunt the German thrust. Whispers filled the room as staff officers began running the numbers in their minds. Fuel consumption, road capacity, daylight hours, weather forecasts, every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. 2 weeks, perhaps longer if snowstorms worsened. That was the accepted reality of modern warfare. Armies moved deliberately. Bound by logistics and procedure. Then Patton spoke. He did not raise his voice or hedge his answer. Calm and confident, he said he could move by the morning of December 22nd. 3 days. The words seemed to echo in the cold air, drawing stunned looks from nearly everyone present. Some officers assumed he had misunderstood the question. Others thought he was exaggerating to inspire confidence. Eisenhower studied Patton closely, searching for any sign of uncertainty. There was none. Patton was not bluffing. He had anticipated this crisis before it erupted. While others believed the Ardennes sector was quiet, Patton had seen the warning signs and prepared accordingly. His staff had already mapped the roads north, identified the fastest-moving divisions, calculated fuel requirements, and developed contingency plans for exactly this situation. While Allied commanders debated what might be possible, Patton had already decided what would be done, unseen by Allied eyes. German planners were making their own calculations nearby. Confident in their assumptions, they believed Patton's army was at least 2 weeks away from influencing the battle. That certainty shaped their decisions and sealed their fate. Within days, they would learn the price of underestimating a commander who valued speed, preparation, and decisive action above all else. Patton didn't hesitate. Eisenhower's question at the Verdun command post cut through the cold, drafty room like a blade. How fast could Third Army pivot north and strike the German offensive? The atmosphere was tense. Maps of the Ardennes lay spread across tables, pins marking German advances that few had anticipated. British officers shifted uneasily, their expressions betraying doubt. Even Eisenhower, calm, measured, accustomed to commanding coalitions and managing egos, raised an eyebrow. Such a maneuver normally took weeks. Armies did not simply turn on command, especially not in winter under enemy pressure. Patton's reply came without drama. 3 days. The room fell silent. To many present, the answer sounded reckless, even delusional. But Patton was not improvising. He was revealing a decision already made, rehearsed, and prepared for long before the Germans struck. While others were still grappling with the scale of the Ardennes offensive, Patton was already operating from a script he had written himself. On his desk sat 3 fully developed attack plans. Not sketches or rough concepts, but complete operational designs, routes marked, timetables calculated, fuel requirements estimated down to the mile. His staff had studied the road networks, identified choke points, and selected divisions capable of rapid movement. Patton knew exactly which units would disengage first, which would lead the advance, and where the blow would fall against the German flank. This was not bravado. It was preparation weaponized. 50 miles to the north, German intelligence officers were reaching very different conclusions. Major General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, believed the Americans were already reeling. His staff assessed that Baston would fall within days, crushed by encirclement and relentless pressure. From there, German forces would continue west, rolling toward the Meuse River and shattering Allied cohesion. American reinforcements, including Patton's Third Army, were estimated to be at least 2 weeks away. This assumption rested on doctrine. German operational thinking emphasized order and method. Large formations disengaged carefully, supply dumps were repositioned systematically, and artillery moved in coordination with infantry. A major offensive pivot required planning, rehearsals, and time. No competent commander, Manteuffel believed, would attempt to reverse an army's direction while actively engaged in combat. To do so would invite chaos. 2 weeks was a conservative estimate and more than enough, they believed, to secure Baston and press the advantage. They were catastrophically wrong. Patton had anticipated this scenario weeks earlier. Since mid-December, he had studied intelligence reports pointing to German buildup in the Ardennes. Where others saw routine troop movements or defensive adjustments, Patton saw warning signs. The Ardennes was quiet. The Germans had used it before, exploiting its reputation as impassable terrain. Patton suspected they would do so again. On December 12, 4 days before the German offensive erupted, Patton summoned his senior staff. He spoke plainly. The Germans were preparing to attack through the Ardennes. When they did, Third Army would be required to pivot north and strike. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, supported the assessment, citing troop concentrations, supply movements, and intercepted signals. The evidence was incomplete, but the pattern was unmistakable. Patton ordered his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, to develop 3 contingency plans, one aimed toward Arlon, one toward Luxembourg, and one toward Diekirch. Each plan assumed a different scale and direction of German advance. Gay was skeptical. Third Army was in the middle of its own offensive toward the Siegfried Line. Diverting staff effort to hypothetical scenarios seemed unnecessary, even wasteful. Patton's reputation for aggression bordered on paranoia, and this felt like another example. But Gay obeyed for the next week. Third Army fought at the Saar while simultaneously preparing for a maneuver that officially did not exist. Staff officers worked long hours studying maps and calculating movement rates. Divisions were evaluated not just for combat power, but for speed, mechanical reliability, and endurance. Fuel consumption was analyzed under winter conditions. Roads were examined for load capacity and traffic flow. Engineers identified bridges that could support heavy armor. Artillery routes were plotted to avoid bottlenecks. All of this was done quietly, without disrupting ongoing operations. By December 18th, 2 days after the German offensive began, the plans were complete. Patton had rehearsed the pivot in his mind and on paper. He had briefed key commanders, ensuring they understood their roles without alarming the broader force. When Eisenhower asked his question at Verdun, Patton did not calculate, he recalled. 3 days was not an aspiration. It was a timetable. The Germans, operating on assumptions of normal Allied behavior, never imagined such a response. They believed they were fighting an opponent bound by caution and procedure. Instead, they faced an army that had already done the intellectual and logistical work while still under fire. Patton had turned preparation into surprise. The speed of Third Army's pivot would not merely relieve Baston, would shatter the German timetable and expose the fatal flaw in their offensive. What the Germans saw as impossibility, Patton had treated as inevitability. And in war, inevitability favors the commander who prepares before the question is ever asked. By December 20th, Baston teetered on the edge of collapse. What had begun as a quiet Belgian crossroads town was now a crucible of survival, ringed by German armor and infantry pressing in from all directions. The 101st Airborne Division paratroopers, trained to fight behind enemy lines, found itself exactly where it had been designed to operate, but under circumstances far more desperate than doctrine ever imagined. Reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division, the Americans were entirely surrounded. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded roughly 18,000 men, yet numbers alone meant little when supply lines were cut, and relief seemed impossibly distant. The situation inside Baston deteriorated hour by hour. Ammunition stocks dwindled to alarming levels. Artillery units rationed shells, firing only when targets were certain. Machine gun crews counted belts and debated whether suppressive fire was worth the cost. Medical supplies were even scarcer. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded, many suffering from frostbite as much as shrapnel and bullets. Surgeons operated without adequate anesthetics, using flashlights when generators failed. Morphine was guarded like gold. Food was limited to cold rations, often shared between men who had not eaten properly in days. Resupply the lifeline the Americans depended upon was impossible. A thick blanket of snow and cloud smothered the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft. The sky, which usually promised hope, delivered nothing but silence. Inside the perimeter, that silence was deceptive. It was not the calm of safety but the stillness of scarcity. Fewer shots rang out because every round mattered. Soldiers listened intently to the sounds beyond the tree line, the grind of German tank tracks on frozen roads, the thud of artillery being repositioned, the distant shouts of enemy infantry probing for weak points. Each noise carried a question: was this the final assault? Morale wavered, but it did not break. Veterans of Normandy and Market Garden understood that survival depended on discipline and stubbornness. Foxholes were deepened, despite frozen ground. Roadblocks were reinforced with whatever could be dragged into place: destroyed vehicles, logs, even furniture pulled from abandoned houses. Patrols slipped out at night, mapping German positions and capturing prisoners when possible, desperate for intelligence. Still, uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Many wondered if higher command even knew how dire their situation had become. On December 22nd, the tension crystallized. A small German delegation approached under a white flag, delivering a formal surrender demand. McAuliffe was given 2 hours to decide. The message was polite, almost courteous, promising honorable treatment if the Americans laid down their arms. The implication was clear: resistance was futile. When McAuliffe read the demand, his initial reaction was disbelief, followed by irritation. His now legendary response, "Nuts," was less bravado than honest frustration. When German officers asked for clarification, an American colonel explained succinctly it meant "go to hell." The word spread rapidly through the perimeter. "Nuts" became a rallying cry, lifting spirits in a town starved of good news. Soldiers laughed, slapped each other on the back, and repeated it with grim pride. Yet the humor masked a brutal truth. Nothing tangible had changed. Baston was still surrounded. Shelling continued day and night. Casualties mounted. Every hour without relief brought the defenders closer to exhaustion and collapse. Far beyond Baston, however, the situation looked very different. Even as the Germans tightened the noose, 3 divisions of Patton's Third Army were already in motion. Roughly 133,000 men, disengaged from fierce fighting along the Saar River and pivoted north, in one of the most audacious operational maneuvers of the war. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the advance, followed closely by the 26th Infantry Division and supporting units. This was not a cautious redeployment, it was a full-scale turn executed under pressure. In winter, while still facing an active enemy, the logistical challenge was staggering. Roads clogged with tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and endless supply columns. Engineers raced ahead to repair bridges and clear obstacles. Military police stood in freezing intersections, directing traffic around the clock. Drivers fought icy roads and mechanical failures, often repairing engines by hand in sub-zero temperatures. Units marched with minimal rest, sleeping in vehicles or roadside ditches. Patton's orders were uncompromising: speed over perfection. Delays were unacceptable. Confusion was tolerated. The army would move, and it would move now. This gamble carried enormous risk. Units advanced with incomplete intelligence, thin supply margins, and limited coordination. Communications lagged behind movement. Some formations arrived without full ammunition loads. Others pressed forward despite fuel shortages. Yet Patton understood the equation better than anyone. Time equaled lives. Every hour Baston held was an hour that demanded relief. Every hour lost increased the chance that the town and the men inside it would fall. German reconnaissance noticed activity, but the weather worked against them. Snowstorms and low clouds obscured the roads and skies. Reports trickled in describing American movements south of Luxembourg, but they were dismissed as routine adjustments or local countermeasures. No one grasped the scale of what was unfolding. By December 21st, German intelligence was already obsolete. An entire American army was on the march, closing the distance while Baston waited cold, surrounded and defiant, counting bullets and listening for the sound of salvation. At 6 a.m. on December 22nd, the counterstrike began. In the half-light of a winter dawn, American armored columns rolled forward through snow-covered fields and narrow Ardennes roads. The 4th Armored Division led the assault. Striking German positions south of Baston near Arlon, engines growled low in the cold air as Sherman tanks emerged from fog and drifting snow, their silhouettes appearing suddenly where German sentries had expected nothing but quiet. Within minutes, artillery opened up, shells ripping through frozen ground and shattering hastily prepared defenses. The Germans were caught completely off guard. An entire armored division, one they did not even know was in the area, had materialized and was attacking in force. German frontline units reeled. Reports from battalion and regimental commanders were confused and contradictory. Some claimed they were facing reconnaissance elements. Others insisted they were under attack by a full corps. The truth became undeniable as American armor punched through roadblocks, infantry riding tanks or advancing behind them, clearing woods and villages with practiced efficiency. This was no probing attack. It was a deliberate, sustained blow aimed directly at the German southern flank. At 5th Panzer Army headquarters, disbelief turned to alarm. Manteufel's staff struggled to reconcile the reports with their operational assumptions. Patton's Third Army was supposed to be tied down along the Saar. Even in the best-case scenario, they believed he was 10 to 14 days away from influencing the battle. Instead, he was here now, attacking with overwhelming speed and coordination. The German timetable, carefully calculated to seize Baston and drive west, began to disintegrate in real time. Manteufel reacted as quickly as he could. Orders flew out to commit reserves that had been earmarked for exploitation rather than defense. The Panzerlehr Division 1 of Germany's most experienced armored formations was rushed into blocking positions. Elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division were diverted from other critical sectors to stem the American advance. But these units were already stretched thin, engaged in heavy fighting elsewhere, low on fuel, and operating under worsening weather conditions. What should have been a cohesive counterblow became a series of rushed, fragmented responses. The German forces now faced a crisis of geometry. They were fighting on two fronts at once. Inside Baston, infantry and armor continued pounding the encircled 101st Airborne Division, attempting to crush the defenders before relief could arrive. Outside the town, Patton's forces were advancing relentlessly, attacking the very units meant to maintain the encirclement. Every battalion diverted south weakened the pressure on Baston. Every hour spent reacting to Patton reduced the chance of a decisive breakthrough toward the Meuse. The initiative, Germany's most precious asset in the Ardennes offensive, was slipping away. Patton, meanwhile, pressed his advantage mercilessly. He understood that speed remained essential. The goal was not simply to reach Baston, but to do so before the Germans could reorganize their defenses. Infantry and armored divisions advanced in parallel, leapfrogging forward whenever resistance stiffened. Artillery units displaced rapidly, firing, moving, and firing again to keep pace with the advance. Engineers worked around the clock, clearing mines, repairing bridges, and widening icy roads to sustain the flow of armor and supplies. Combat was brutal and chaotic. German units fought hard, launching counterattacks from wooded ridges and fortified villages. Snow and fog limited visibility, turning engagements into close-range brawls where tank crews and infantry fought at terrifying proximity. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the momentum belonged to the Americans. Patton's units advanced even when coordination faltered, trusting that adjacent formations would keep up. Orders emphasized aggression above all else. Bypass strong points if possible. Isolate resistance and keep moving north. On December 23rd, the weather finally broke. Clouds lifted, and for the first time in days, Allied aircraft appeared overhead. Fighter bombers roared down the roads leading to Baston, strafing German columns and destroying supply vehicles already critically short of fuel. Airdrops began reaching the 101st Airborne inside the perimeter, delivering ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The psychological impact was immense. For the defenders, it was proof that they had not been forgotten. For the Germans, it was confirmation that time had run out. Manteuffel informed Field Marshal Walter Model that the offensive was in jeopardy. Patton's arrival had shattered every assumption underpinning the German plan. The Americans had responded faster than doctrine said was possible. The southern flank was collapsing under sustained pressure, and the forces besieging Baston were increasingly at risk of being cut off themselves. What had been envisioned as a bold, decisive thrust was now a desperate struggle to stabilize a rapidly deteriorating situation. The counterstrike had changed everything. Baston was no longer an isolated pocket awaiting destruction. It was becoming a magnet drawing in German resources that could not be spared. Patton's audacity, his willingness to move an entire army at breakneck speed in the middle of winter had broken the German rhythm. The Ardennes offensive, once driven by surprise and momentum, was now fighting against time, weather, and a relentless enemy that refused to slow down. By striking when and where the Germans least expected, Patton had not merely relieved pressure on Baston. He had seized the initiative for the Allies, turning a crisis into an opportunity and marking the moment when the tide in the Ardennes began irrevocably to turn. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26th, the long-awaited moment finally arrived. Through the snow-choked roads and shattered outskirts of the town, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division pushed into Baston. The siege was broken. For the men of the 101st Airborne Division and their attached units, it was not a dramatic cinematic climax, but a quiet, overwhelming release of tension that had been building for days. Exhausted soldiers emerged from foxholes, cellars, and ruined buildings to greet the tank crews. Hands were shaken, backs were slapped, and some men simply sat down in the snow, overcome by relief. A few cried openly not from fear, but from the sudden realization that they had survived. The lead vehicle was a Sherman tank known as Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 37th Tank Battalion. Its arrival marked the physical and symbolic end of the encirclement. For days, that battalion had fought its way north through relentless resistance ambush from wooded ridges, anti-tank guns hidden in villages, and German armor attempting to block every road leading to Baston. Progress had been measured in yards, not miles. Tanks advanced cautiously, infantry clearing ground foot by foot. Every bridge, every crossroads had been contested. That Cobra King reached the perimeter at all was a testament to the cost already paid. Inside Baston, the defenders were in desperate condition. Ammunition had been rationed to the point where some units were nearly combat ineffective. Medical supplies were critically low. Wounded men lay wrapped in blankets in unheated buildings, many having waited days for proper treatment. Food had been stretched thin, and exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone. Yet the garrison had held. They had done exactly what Patton needed them to do: survive long enough for relief to arrive. Baston had become not just a tactical objective, but a test of endurance, discipline, and faith in command. Strategically, the relief of Baston was decisive. The town was a vital road hub, controlling multiple routes through the Ardennes. Its capture was essential to the German plan to drive west toward the Meuse River. By holding Baston, the Americans had denied the Germans the flexibility they needed to sustain their offensive. Now, with Patton's forces breaking through, that denial became permanent. The German timetable, already strained, collapsed entirely. General Hasso von Manteuffel understood the implications immediately. The failure to take Baston was not a temporary setback. It was a fatal blow. The 5th Panzer Army could no longer advance with coherence. Units were low on fuel, ammunition, and replacements. Formations were fragmented, pulled in multiple directions to respond to Patton's pressure. The initiative was gone. Instead of forcing the Allies to react, German commanders were now scrambling to hold ground and prevent encirclement of their own forces. Higher up the chain, the response was denial. Hitler demanded the offensive continue, insisting that renewed effort and determination could still produce victory. Orders were issued to press on despite the mounting evidence that the window of opportunity had closed. But the reality on the ground could not be ignored. German troops were exhausted. Supply lines were overstretched and vulnerable to Allied air power, which now operated freely as the weather cleared. Every mile gained earlier in the offensive now became a liability that had to be defended for the Allies. Baston became a symbol of resilience and operational audacity. For Patton, it was confirmation of a principle he had long preached: speed wins wars. In reflecting on the operation, he emphasized not just the movement of tanks and infantry, but the tempo of decision-making. Patton had acted faster than his enemy thought possible. He had planned while fighting, prepared for contingencies before they were needed, and committed his forces without waiting for perfect conditions. The Germans, by contrast, had been methodical. They had analyzed terrain, supply requirements, force ratios, and historical precedents. Their planning was thorough but rigid. What they failed to account for was an opponent willing to accept risk in exchange for speed. Patton did not wait for certainty. He created it through action. By the time German intelligence realized what was happening, the Third Army was already on the move. By the time they reacted, Baston was being relieved. The lesson of Baston extended beyond the Ardennes. It demonstrated that operational speed could compensate for logistical strain, imperfect information, and even unfavorable conditions if command decisions were timely and decisive. Patton's ability to synchronize movement, logistics, and combat under extreme pressure transformed what could have been a disaster into a turning point. As night fell on December 26th, Baston was no longer a besieged town but a rallying point for Allied momentum. The men of the 101st Airborne, battered but unbroken, remained in position as Patton's forces widened the corridor and pushed the Germans back. The Ardennes offensive, once a grave threat, had been blunted beyond recovery. Baston had held. Patton had arrived, and in the frozen forests of Belgium, the impossible had been made possible not by numbers alone, but by speed, foresight, and the refusal to wait while the enemy acted. In a January 1945 press conference, with the Battle of the Bulge finally broken and the Allied line restored, a reporter asked General George S. Patton how he had managed such an astonishingly fast maneuver. The question reflected what much of the world believed, that the relief of Baston had been a miracle of speed, an extraordinary act bordering on the impossible. Patton's answer cut through the admiration and disbelief like a blade. "We didn't move quickly," he said. "We moved normally. Everyone else just moved too slowly." The remark was classic Patton, blunt, dismissive, and deliberately provocative. Yet beneath the bravado lay a profound truth about military culture and command philosophy. What the Germans and even many Allied commanders had viewed as an extraordinary feat was, in Patton's mind, simply the result of doing what an army was supposed to do when properly prepared and aggressively led. The difference was not one of capability, but of mindset. To German intelligence officers, Patton's maneuver defied logic. Their calculations were based on doctrine that emphasized order, caution, and sequential movement. Armies disengaged, regrouped, resupplied, and only then advanced. Deviating from that process invited chaos. From their perspective, Patton's pivot north while still engaged with the enemy was not just dangerous, it violated the rules by which modern armies were expected to operate. Their mistake was not in recognizing the risk. Their mistake was in assuming that risk equaled impossibility. For Patton, risk was not something to be avoided. It was something to be managed, accepted, and exploited. What appeared reckless to cautious commanders was, to him, an acceptable price for seizing the initiative. He understood that time was the most valuable currency in war. Every hour spent waiting for perfect conditions was an hour the enemy used to entrench, reorganize, or escape. Speed, even imperfect speed, created opportunities that caution never could. The relief of Baston quickly became one of Patton's most celebrated achievements. Newspapers across the United States carried headlines praising the dramatic rescue of the besieged 101st Airborne Division. Photographs of exhausted paratroopers and snow-covered tanks symbolized American resilience and determination. Patton's reputation as an audacious, hard-driving commander was cemented in the public imagination. To many, Baston was the defining moment of his career, but Patton himself did not linger on it. In his diary entry dated December 29th, just days after the siege was broken, his tone was characteristically unsentimental. Baston, he wrote, had been a necessary diversion, a critical step forced upon him by circumstances, but it was not the goal. The real objective was the destruction of the German army in the field. Defensive victories, Patton believed, could never win wars. Only relentless offense, constant pressure, continuous movement, and unceasing attacks could bring final victory.